For those of you who orient by means of aesthetics, you'll be able to notice the distinct Gen X sensibility of my presentation. Decidedly don't have a millennial skillfulness in creating pretty things. So when Thomas and Stephanie and I spoke about this a while back, I made note of that very specific frame of being right around the middle of a portal of movement between one paradigm and another at multiple different levels, meaning we as a human family are at that point. And then in some sense, this group is also potentially at that point where the arc has brought us to a middle position. And so I thought about that. And for some reason, I found myself creating a presentation to endeavor to compress as best I could some of the most specific, you think almost like an archipelago, the points that are above the surface of the water, learnings that I've had over the past 15 years exploring this set of questions. And just to sort of do a little tiny bit of background, we can begin where Thomas left off, where I had just exited being a technology entrepreneur in the sort of NASDAQ sensibility. And this was around 2008. So just as the global financial crisis was heating up, and this put me in a movement of asking questions and joining groups and funding initiatives and finding different efforts to learn more and more. And so I found myself on my own personal journey of exploration, learning, I think somewhat similar to the arc that you've been going through, and having continuously, how would you say it? I would say in some sense, demoralizing conversations with profound local experts about particular domains like nuclear non-proliferation or the consequences of the concentration of heavy metals and hormones in amphibians, declining testosterone rates, fill in the blank, soil decline. And came to my own conclusion that the paradigm that we were operating under was the fundamental thing that could no longer continue. And then, of course, the inquiry of what does that mean? Can we diagnose that in any deep way? This is the deep code reference. And can we develop a method to move through that in an orderly fashion? So that is the effort that I put into this presentation. And I would say from a thematic perspective, we might actually see the form of a didactic expression, monological, as being formally of the paradigm from which we are coming. And then perhaps it will open us into a conversation which will be of the essence of the place to which we are trying to go, if that makes any sense. We'll try to embody the destination on the other side of the presentation. So I'll try to keep it snappy. Now we'll get to see whether or not I'm able to pull off the technological magic of sharing my screen and presenting. All right, can everybody see that? Perfect. So a way of framing it is if we take a look at the canonical formulation of paradigms from Kuhn, I would say that he uses the term paradigm shift, but what he actually describes are paradigm catastrophes, circumstances where the shift from one to the other has a characteristic of being rather inelegant, having a crisis or a breakdown as necessary to get from one to the other, and as a result being rather destructive. Of course, we can generalize from the scientific domain to any particular paradigm style shift. And given the magnitude and scope of the paradigm shift we're finding ourselves in, we might want to actually find a way to cause it to be a shift. Briefly, I think it might be useful to have ourselves settled on why it is that these sorts of things tend so often to show up as catastrophes. Why don't they naturally move from one to the other? And I think we can boil it down to three fundamental characteristics. One is that the existing institutions, which by and large command effectively all resource allocation choices, typically can only resource that which is legible to themselves already. And they often will, many times unconsciously, sometimes consciously, extinguish the emerging potentialities and novelties that are part of a new paradigm. Equally, and coming from a different direction, a paradigm, of course, is coming from the interior, from the mindset of those who are running running it as much as it's coming from the X tier of the institutions that reproduce it. And the mindset can only produce epicycles. It can only continue to explicate the paradigm that it's running in its own interior. Or double down, right? Actually put more intensity. It's the classic Einsteinian problem, that it's madness to continue to do something that's clearly not working, but madness is the characteristic of what happens when you're stuck inside a paradigmatic construct. And any effort to escape it from the mindset perspective doesn't get resource allocation or legibility from the institutional perspective. So you get yourself caught into a loop. And then the last piece, which we can explicate in conversation if we'd like, but from the domain of evolutionary theory, there's two fundamental strategies, one called hill climbing and one called valley crossing. And a primary problematic of why paradigms get stuck is that precisely the success of a paradigm produces a selection for hill climbing dynamics all the way down to the individual level, and a tendency to extinguish or eliminate valley crossing dynamics. A simple way of putting it is that we end up with everybody ends up being a Goldman Sachs banker optimizing for their local selective advantage. And anyone who didn't make that choice is sitting in the periphery, oftentimes quite unempowered and perhaps psychologically harmed. It's a deeper question than that, but that's a simple way of putting it. So can we do this consciously? Can we perhaps for the first time in human history understand a meta theory of paradigmatic shift and therefore endeavor to move into that space and make it happen elegantly, which would be a good thing to have? If that's what we want to do, I would propose that there are four primary problems we have to deal with. On the one, we actually have to keep the current infrastructure adequately functional. We are running a very complex system, the most complex effort developed in human history. And we have to actually keep energy and food and everything else moving well. And that's a lot of work. This cannot be a revolutionary interruption. We cannot have a breakdown of the current system beyond a relatively trivial amount. We have to move in medias res. More on that in a moment. At the same time, we must be conscious of the fact that we will too often find ourselves in an adversarial relationship with legacy institutions. Most of the time, this is simply unconscious, meaning we're not legible to legacy institutions. We don't fit the model. We don't fit the pattern. The kinds of things we're proposing either don't make sense or operating at a level of complexity that are difficult to process. Sometimes, however, it will be a conscious adversarial relationship. We have to find a way to navigate that reality. What I've found personally is the third point is the most challenging, which is if we accept the premise that the mindset of the given paradigm is as much a problem as the institutions, we find ourselves having to navigate in liminality, navigating without reference to a paradigm to help us make effective choices and make sense of our environment. And this is a very tricky place to be. And then last, particularly given where we are now, we are going to be dealing with a continuing eruption of systemic crises. And we're going to have to be able to fight those fires while we are on the journey simultaneously. We don't have the tremendous advantage of being in a place where everything is actually already quite stable. We're nearing the end, getting close to an actual catastrophe. And so we're going to have to navigate choppy waters. So that's the set of challenges in navigating a transition that I have identified myself. Before we talk a little bit more detail around those 4 or 5 challenges, let me outline 3 thematic principles that I believe is a good way to compress the sort of the operating methodology. Restoration of our indigenous capacities, the techniques of that navigation in liminality, and to the degree to which we can do so, can we identify or sketch out something like a map that can bring us to the future? So these are categorically distinct. The first is, in some sense, the best news, and that is that niche transition, the ability to move from one, in fact, entire culture, fit and adapted to a ecology, to another, is perhaps the primary thing that Homo sapiens discovered that makes us Homo sapiens. It's in some sense our most fundamental characteristic as a species. Therefore, we have a hypothesis that there is something deeply ingrained, probably at the biological level and at the most foundational cultural and social levels, that trigger and reactivate and reorient us towards the characteristics of how we go about engaging in these transitions. I can explore this in as much depth as you'd like, but I'll just put it out there for the moment as a hypothesis. If that is the case, then one of the thematic principles is a matter of recovery, a restoration, a regeneration of our own intrinsicness, not a development of new capacity, which is good news. We don't have to become anything superhuman. We merely need to return to being human. And so this looks like things like repairing a whole-mindedness as opposed to, say, verbal, semantic, left brain dominance and embodied cognition, and rebuilding skillfulness in maturity of dialogue, the distinction between dialogue and dialogos and debate, rebuilding context-rich or context-sensitive sense-making. If you recall, a classic story from anthropology is that when given an image of a person walking through a forest, a typical Westerner would describe it as such. Oh, that's a picture of a person walking through a forest. Whereas a typical indigenous person would say, that's a forest. Oh, yes, there's a person in there as well. It's a different way of looking at context. And then, by the way, in many cases, actually taking advantage of the fact that we still do have indigenous populations who are running indigenousness effectively. And can we activate, integrate, and work with these populations on their own terms? So it'd be things that come out of this particular principle. All right, navigation and liminality. So we find ourselves in the troubling circumstance that the tools, techniques, processes, even habits, in some cases even concepts that we have so effectively honed in the process of the paradigm that got us here might in fact be intrinsically tied to the problem. And so we have to be careful. We have to detach ourselves from as much of that as possible and still find a way to navigate. Now here's again a piece of good news. Attached to the previous point, the navigation of complexity qua complexity appears to be trans-paradigmatic, meaning that it's more fundamental, perhaps even at the evolutionary developmental sense, than the frame that gives rise to paradigms. Okay. So we can take a look at that and we can do a general study of what trans-paradigmatic navigation and complexity tends to look like. We can begin to reconfigure our capacity to do that kind of thing and become the ones who are capable of that sort of navigation. Here's some examples. And by the way, in parentheses, groups that have been working on these particular pieces, I think, to a high degree of effectiveness. A reorientation towards people, away from process, towards character and development of virtue, trusting individual capacity and empowering individuals and groups of individuals, rather than endeavoring to focus on building large-scale systems to solve problems. In the military, this became the emergence of increasingly special forces orientation and away from large systematic army-style efforts. The basic approach that Dave Snowden points out is the iterative exploration of an unexplored space requires safe to fail probes and then a continuous relearning and redevelopment of safe to fail probes. You can imagine yourself in a dark room. You don't just begin running in a single direction as fast as you can. You reach out carefully in a circle. And then as you get a better sense of what the shape of the space that you're in is, you can begin to navigate with more and more confidence. The next point's profound and difficult to fully express, but it has to do with a reorientation towards an orienting basis in choice from meaningfulness, or a category known as values, rather than goals and objectives. This is a difficult epistemological distinction to make, and we can go into that in some depth if you'd like, but just think about that as a directionality. Also in epistemology, high sensitivity to nuance and subtlety, rather than, for example, orienting towards already knowing the answer to the question or wanting to force it into a frame that you already have. wisdom rather than intelligence. It's a somewhat simple way of putting it. Not easy to do, but easy to say. Once upon a time, I conditioned this as rule omega, which has to do with the sort of ethos of relationality and dialogos, meaning we're trying to do something which is subtle and difficult. And so I'm going to listen very closely to what it is you might be struggling to express, because even at our best, we're going to struggle to express it. And maybe I'll get a bit of it, and I'll try to give it back to you with more clarity. And perhaps together we can get close, something like that. My friend John Vervaeke, who I mentioned meeting in person for the first time about a week ago, has done really great work from a cognitive science perspective in pointing out the prioritization of participatory knowing rather than propositional knowing. This makes sense, and because if we're going through a paradigm transition, we are going to change. The ones who are on the other side of that portal are going to be different than the ones who are on this side. And it's not a matter of simply changing the information in our heads. And then finally, we always will have to build structures. We'll build organizations, we'll build processes, but we have to think of them in the form of scaffolding or embryonic thinking, meaning we'll fail. What we build will be wrong. We'll need to build, learn, reconfigure, and then build again, and then learn and break things down, right? A mindset that's oriented towards a evolutionary approach as opposed to a developmental approach, if you have that distinction. All right. As you can imagine, all of these are super compressed, and I apologize if it's too dense to make any sense of. Perhaps we can explore more. From my explorations, I've come to the conclusion that we can, in a somewhat sketched fashion, grasp some principles, again, high mountains in the distance, that can give us a sense of a map, things that we can use to simplify our exploration. We're not in pure liminality. And in fact, I would say, in point of fact, for at least the past 30 or 40 years, we've actually been in a space of the emergence of this novelty. And so what has emerged can give us a hint of what, in some sense, is the essence of what wants to emerge. An example is that I would say with a high degree of confidence, much of the nature of the new space we're going to be moving into is characterized by the intrinsic consequences of what Marshall McLuhan would call the digital. If we say, for example, that we've been living in a meta paradigm that's been dominated by the consequences of writing or literacy, McLuhan's work and many others can point us to ways of thinking about what must be the case in a new paradigm that is characterized by the essence of digital. From a different direction, it appears also to be intrinsically or unescapably the case that any future paradigm must be intrinsically planetary. And this means it must take into account the whole of humanity, the whole of nature, and by the way, the whole of technology, in the complex relationality between and amongst, and at the complete planetary scale. I'll point out, by the way, that the concept of international is not the same as the concept of planetary. And this points to why international institutions, the best that the old paradigm could do, are not the right kind of tool. Okay, next, I mentioned it previously, an embryological or a generative sensibility. And maybe a way of thinking about this is from the point of view of agriculture, cultivation, permaculture. There's an order of operations, and things move from stages, and each stage has to go through its own process before it becomes the foundation for the development of the next stage. We could think of it, and I think the metaphor of embryology has proven to be quite effective. This means we're in a process of cultivation, and something about the new paradigm is not designed by us, but rather is nurtured in its own development, in its own emergence. And we are participating in that to the degree to which we can, much more than we are making it happen. The next is a design principle, proposes the concept of reinvention. And the notion here is to say that the most fundamental characteristics of our existing institutions, almost by necessity, will be conserved. It's a simple example. We might say an institutional structure like science. However, we won't move sideways. Right? This isn't a process of continuing to build epicycles or to kludge in the software development sense, the existing institutions. Rather, what we do is we go through a process of identifying the transcendent essence of what science is, and then we learn how to re-embody that under the terms of the new paradigm. So I think of it as up, sideways, down, rather than trying to go sideways. It's a design methodology for building new institutions. The next one's fun. Look for some moments of scenius. This is a concept that Brian Eno coined, the genius of a scene. And the idea here is that moments of scenius have the characteristic of being autopoetic and autochthonous. They're pre-capital, pre-marketing, and money is not involved. And yet, oftentimes have gathered significant attention. People have gathered around them for intrinsic reasons, in many cases, reasons they can't themselves articulate, and quite often have developed interesting, potent, innovative things. This is a good sign, right? Where moments of scenius have emerged in the field. It's almost like noticing where there's a hot spot at the bottom of the ocean. There's something happening here that is of the future. Can we allow that to guide us more and more towards what that sort of thing is? And then the last, which is different in kind, and that is, can we actually use strategy? I'll talk about this in a moment, to identify, secure, and anchor on what might be the commanding heights of the new paradigm. What are the places that are of the axis mundi or fundamental? And by the way, strategically have superior position to the current paradigm? And can we get there and allow those to be strengthened and solidified and become a base of operations for the development of the new paradigm? All right. Screen freeze, there we go. So going back to our 4 points, can we consciously navigate a paradigm shift? When we look at the first point, keeping the current infrastructure adequately functional, there's a couple of things that I think are worth putting out there. One, on the one hand, as we discovered, for example, in the context of the COVID situation, and to a lesser extent, as we've discovered if you watch closely what happened when Elon took over Twitter, we actually have a decent amount of slack in the current institutions because of how dysfunctional they are. And it is plausible, in fact, I would propose likely, that if the most competent people can simply be liberated from dysfunction to do their job, they could do so. And we could hold a decent amount of what we need through sort of ordinary human virtue. However, at the same time, the same experience, particularly the COVID experience, reveals the depth of complexity of the social structure that we've developed, particularly fragile points like supply chains and things that locate across cultural and geographic areas. So that's a real risk. We'll have to keep our minds focused on those points. So on the one hand, there's a sort of a softening and a gentling and a reorientation of responsibility in the hands of autonomous people. And on the other hand, some kind of infrastructure is able to notice where things are breaking and construct bridge points where possible. Another point that I don't think gets enough press is that those of us who are likely going to be playing a significant role in this don't actually have a lot of direct familiarity with this complex machinery. I've called this phase the disappearance of the boomers. And over the next decade, the last generation that was actually present to the building out of the old paradigm will be retiring or passing away. And with them, an extraordinary amount of knowledge. We're going to find ourselves having to run machines that we don't understand. So what this means heuristically is we have to tread carefully. We're going to have to be operating in medias res. To the maximum degree possible, we want to focus on upregulation of people who are currently holding in important elements competently with integrity, and then link them together in larger and larger structures of mutual support. All right, the point of adversarial relationship. This is frankly very, very difficult. The lack of access to human and material resources has, I think, is a principal reason why paradigm shift is typically paradigm catastrophe. And we can ask the French aristocracy of 1787 about this question. And my experience has been that it is very, very difficult to get people who currently are responsible for resource allocation to engage in any form of resource allocation in the context of novel paradigms. So 2 points that I would put out there, and they're actually operating at sort of a barbell direction. One is, to the degree to which we can find these locations that have decisive strategic advantage from the point of view of the new paradigm. If we can find them and take them, which is to say, actually build them out to a point of generative strength, autopoietic strength on their own, these then become the locations for building the new paradigm in indifference to, and in some sense in resistance with, the legacy institutions. A simple example is, consider if OpenAI had been designed properly. Consider if at this very moment, that emergence, which went from almost nothing to potentially decisive strategic position in a matter of years, and frankly, a relatively small amount of capital, if it hadn't been designed naively from the point of view of the paradigm that it's operating in, well, this would be a very powerful generator working on the other side of the portal. From my point of view, the most likely location here are new forms of collective intelligence. And a long time ago, Jim Rutt and I actually put together a formula on a whiteboard that pointed out that roughly 300 of the right people integrated in the right way could prove decisive. The fact that 10 years later, we haven't been able to pull that off is quite telling. Then the opposite side of the direction, and this is something that I believe you're going to be hearing from Daniel Schmachtenberger later, and something that he's been pioneering quite effectively through his CRI institution, is something that I've been calling the neo-neocortex, which is effectively a distributed network of individuals who are operating from a relatively robust instantiation of the new paradigm, but have developed skillfulness of synergizing with and in support of the legacy institutions. The neo-neocortex did not replace the neocortex did not replace the cortex. It simply created a paper-thin layer on top of it that integrated with and upregulated its functionality. So these are two distinct elements that I think are both necessary in relationship with the existing institutional structures. All right, navigating liminality, bottoms up and top down. From a bottoms up perspective, which is more natural, this is the gentleness piece. This is the watering the soil and allowing the seeds to emerge on their own piece, a cultivation, nurturing sensibility. I've thought about a notion of a holographic method, which is a bit esoteric. You can talk about it more if you'd like, but the gist of it is these new things are trying to form. People are, in fact, discovering elements of the new paradigm and endeavoring to embody them willy-nilly all over the place. What's being looked for is ways of upregulating what works and continuously enabling the hard-earned discoveries of a very diverse population of people, in some sense, everyone, everywhere, all the time, to actually have a directionality to them. A lot of the design principles that we found, for example, in the regenerative permaculture movement, the movement from systems thinking to complex adaptive systems thinking, from goals-based to values-based. There's a lot of design work that's been done. And if we operate with these design principles, these precisely have the characteristic of upregulating distributed discovery. Again, a key element here is a focus on individuals and people. And by the way, I'll make the distinction between individuals and people. Individuals are old paradigm, people are new paradigm. And what's funny is there's a throwback too. One of the things McLuhan points to is that when we move from one technical substrate to a new technical substrate, at least a third is a recall or a recovery from the distant past. So the rebuilding of our indigenousness, the rebuilding of whole humans is a big piece. And by the way, one of the more humane aspects of the new paradigm. And then finally, from the point of view of toolkits, to the degree to which you can orient towards platforms rather than products, towards protocols rather than platforms, things that are intrinsically empowering distributed autopoiesis, this is a good instantiation of a design principle. But at the same time, there is in fact top-down. And we can take a look at the map, we can identify locations, and we can endeavor to use the best capabilities of the old paradigm to at least get us into positions of real possibility. So, for example, this journey to Dunbar, this new forms of collective intelligence. There are some key elements in that location that are worthy of resourced investigation, and even to the degree to which they fail, they will fail forward. And of course, I mentioned the issue of crisis mitigation and crisis management. The reality is that we can actually put together something that looks like think tanks, if you'd like, that can use new techniques of sense making to colorfully highlight where the likely crisis points and to identify what are valid solutions to those crisis points, well have advantage of us running into it. As a way of describing that, I found myself, gosh, I guess about 10 or 12 years ago, sitting at the Santa Fe Institute in a meta discussion of the fundamental principle of virality, watching a presentation on being done by folks from Los Alamos who'd been building computer models. And they were doing a presentation on the probability of future pandemics. The TLDR was that the likelihood of a pandemic like COVID was effectively 100% over some reasonable time frame, given the underlying of the world that we live in. Okay, well, if you know it's a risk, what's it look like? What's it look like as it begins to move through different phase transitions into risk? And can we pre-design from the new paradigm point of view what are proper ways to address that kind of risk? Now, we can make a long list of those kinds of things. And we don't even have to talk about this one because we already did, right? Mitigating systemic crises. This is largely, from my point of view, about developing this neocortex, both on its own terms, discovering new forms of governance that have the capacity to unlock a much larger level of collective intelligence per human being participating, and the unique sort of ambassadorial skillfulness to figure out how to bring that capacity into existing institutions past their legibility thresholds, past their operating limitations, and empower them as much as possible with these new capacities. I just have to point out how incredibly important that is. I'm not sure if this has been spoken of at all in the arc getting here, but a key element of why we are facing paradigm catastrophe is that the existing institutions categorically don't have the capacity to navigate the complexity of the set of crises that we are heading towards in anything like an elegant fashion. And they will continue to do a, let's say, worse and worse job for very describable reasons. Right? This is not a random thing. And so we actually are obligated to find a way to dramatically upregulate their capacity and, to the extent necessary, offload that responsibility to new institutions that, at least in principle, do have that capacity. All right, so last slide, and then we can move into the other side of the portal. Two notions that came to me as I was walking around the lake listening to the birds that I thought might be of interest here. One might be, what does the concept of return on investment mean when you're moving across a paradigm boundary? The notion of investment, the notion of the metrics or the measures, the units of account that you use on one side of a paradigm have a weird orthogonality to those fundamental units on the other side of a portal. It's a bit like that scene from the movie Arrival, where they went up through the tunnel and they moved from a place where gravity was going one direction to where gravity was going another direction. There's a bit of a disorientation there. And as an example, the potency of the transition we're going through, this whole commotion around large language models and the potential fact that we've moved into a new phase of AGI, it is entirely plausible. I would say most likely that AGI will completely transform the role of the category, the computational unit of money in collective intelligence. So if we're using money as our way of measuring return on investment, we may be in for a bit of trouble because money itself may be at risk in this transition. Perhaps putting it a little bit more simply, one thing we can say for certain is that money in the old paradigm is a false accounting money. Model deeply, deeply is premised on a maximization of the externalization of costs. So while we do an accounting, we don't do anything like a full accounting. And we might say, for example, at a minimum, that moving through the paradigm portal is a moving from a false accounting to a full accounting kind of money. So what would it look like to be doing an ROI? We're investing false accounting money and are endeavoring to return full accounting money. Perhaps a topic of conversation. The other one is this question of what would it look like to apply the design principles of reinvention to the artifact of the Sustainable Development Goals. You think about some of the points that I've been making, a movement from intelligence, which effectively has to do with a management mindset, analytic mindset, to wisdom, which has to do with a participatory knowing approach, a becoming the ones who approach. This has profound consequences for the category that is currently occupied by SDGs. So we might also explore that. All right. All right, that's what I have to say in that format. So let me exit the share.